Hello my friends, it's time for an experiment, and like all the best ones, it's going to involve me drinking quite a bit of beer. Let's get into it. So what is the point of this little test that I've set up today? Basically, I want to see how a beer has fared in plastic or PET bottles versus glass bottles versus the beer that's still left in the keg. So there's kind of two elements to this test, really. First of all, testing out the glass versus the PET bottle, but then also more generally, the quality of the beer that I'm packaging using the bowl iTap, so a counter pressure bottle filling device essentially. And I've done that by packaging two lots of the beer, one plastic bottle and one glass bottle that went straight into the fridge. So that was kept at basically the same temperature as the kegged beer, and another two bottles, again, one plastic, one glass, that have been kept at room temperature. Now, that has been over a period of around about 4 weeks. So I want to see the impact of the temperature there, as well as the packaging material itself, and so on. So should be interesting. I'll just explain a little bit about why I want to do this now. I've drawn quite a bit of inspiration from a whole load of bottling type videos, very similar to this, from Dr. Han's channel. So do go and check those out. He may well have done a video very similar to this one, if not the same premise. But yeah, from those videos, but also my own experience of using PET bottles, I was pretty convinced that they were okay at first, and I've used them a lot for beer mails in the past, and I was also using them to send beers off to competitions. But after a few comments from people judging competitions, and particularly I think some of the comments that I saw from the guys at the Malt Miller after judging one of their competitions with Elusive, it did start me questioning the quality of beer that's going to arrive when it's been packaged in PET bottles. Now, there are a few facts that we can get into here. Now, I'm not a scientist. I'm certainly not a materials sort of scientist or engineer for food packaging or anything like that. So all I will say is that it is a fairly easily researched fact that PET is not entirely impervious to oxygen ingress. Now, I always thought that if it was holding pressure in the bottle and there wasn't liquid leaking out of it, that gas wouldn't be able to get into it. But that is not in fact the case. You can still have migration of kind of oxygen molecules and other gas molecules across a barrier, like in a PET bottle, even when it is maintaining pressure and so on. Although gas pressure can be very gradually lost over time as well if that material is permeable enough. So PET is not an ideal packaging material for beer for that reason, and that's probably the main reason that you don't really see commercial beers packaged in PET bottles either. I mean, I don't know any commercial beers that are packaged in PET bottles. If you're aware of anyone doing that, then let me know in the comments. Beer is very susceptible to oxidation, as unfortunately quite a few of us have found out to our cost. And again, that was one of the reasons I wanted to look at this, because I've certainly had my own beers that have become oxidized. I've had beers that were sent to me that have become oxidized, and it did seem to be more of an issue when it came to beers that were sent in PET bottles. There's also the competition element to consider here. Now, I started sending beers off to competitions in glass bottles after hearing some of that feedback from judges and so on, and pretty soon after that, I saw a fairly big shift in the results that I was getting. Now, I'm not saying it's purely down to the packaging method that I was using or the packaging material I was using, but I certainly got more consistent results than what I was getting previously. I had beers that would do well in competition and score well. I've had a few beers that placed in competitions and I was very happy with. But equally, I had some beers that would come back with feedback that I was surprised at and that didn't really match up to what I was drinking out of the keg at that point. So I saw a pretty big change. In fact, most of the stuff that you can see on the shelf behind me here in terms of the rosettes and medals and so on did come after I switched over to packaging to glass. So again, there's pretty, good anecdotal evidence, at least there, from me personally, that it made an improvement in terms of my competition beers. Now, we also need to consider that people aren't just using these to transport beers to other people. Some people are bottling up beer into PET bottles and keeping it longer term for their own purposes, for home consumption if they're not kegging or they're not using glass bottles. So the time periods can vary quite a lot for this. I generally would have been using it for sending beers out or competition beers, but even in that scenario, the beer might be travelling in temperatures that you don't have any control over. It might be left in storage that's not temperature controlled. It might be a few weeks between beers getting drunk, either at a competition or at somebody else's house when they've been sent it as beer mail. So I thought that the period of about 4 weeks was a good kind of middle point between, what you might see in terms of how long it takes for a beer to be sent and drunk at a competition or for beer mail, and also how long people might be storing beers if they're doing a whole batch into plastic bottles and keeping it for themselves. In fact, in that case, it might be much longer than 4 weeks. It could be several months or even longer. So yeah, that's the premise. The beer that I've used is one that I chose because it is a hazy IPA. It's obviously going to be more susceptible to damage through oxidation because of that. It's not the biggest in terms of like the oats and wheats and other adjuncts in terms of percentage wise, which can make it more vulnerable, but basically out of all the beers I had, this was one that would be most likely to show up oxidation. And this is my kind of control sample that I've got here. So this is off of the keg. It was actually based on Life and Death by Vocation. I'll put the recipe down below if anyone wants to look into it. I'm not going to go into that now because it's not really relevant, but it's not a very good clone. It doesn't taste like that much like Life and Death, but it is a very nice beer in its own right. So this isn't super fresh. It's been in the keg for a few months now, but it's still got great aroma. The colour on there is nice and bright, and yeah, smells fresh. Has a lovely hoppy flavour there. Loads of Citra on this one. I used a packet of Citra Incognito in this that kind of really is ruling the roost in terms of the flavour that we're getting off of this beer. But yeah, so this is the control sample. We'll see how the bottled beers compare to that. So let's get them into a glass and see what we can see. So let's look at these versus the kind of control sample first of all in terms of the visuals. I've got the two plastic bottles beers on the outside, the glass bottles on the inside, and these ones were the ones that were kept in the fridge. So the light in here isn't the best for this, to be honest, but looking at this one, this is not too bad. So I was expecting a bigger colour difference there with the plastic bottle. It is slightly darker, so there's definitely a slight darkening of colour, but it doesn't look, especially if you look at it in isolation on its own, like a clearly oxidized beer. Yeah, so I wouldn't look at that in the glass and immediately think there was something wrong with it. Compared to the glass bottle, I would say that that's pretty close. Very difficult for me to tell any difference in colour between those two. Let me just compare them to each other. So glass bottle in this hand, plastic bottle in this hand. And again, yeah, the plastic bottle is slightly darker. Now, ones that were kept at room temperature, bit more of a stark difference there. This is starting to look a little bit more brown. So this was 4 weeks at room temperature in a plastic bottle. There is definitely some oxidation going on there in terms of the colour change. That's starting to look a little brown, especially compared to that. The glass bottle, looks pretty similar. really should have a light in here that I can shine through these. That would be very helpful right now, especially as I'm filming this at night time. But colour wise, I can't tell a huge amount of difference there. And I just want to check. So that's the 2 glass bottles. And again, fridge versus room temperature. They look pretty good. They both look about the same colour to me. So I'm not seeing a huge change in the glass bottles. But yeah, that's glass at room temperature. That's plastic at room temperature. There's a very clear difference. So visually, the keg sample or control beer and the 2 glass bottled beers look pretty, similar. So let's check them out in terms of the aroma and flavour and see if that stands up. I know ideally you'd want to be doing things like this, kind of blind testing and triangle testing and all the rest of it, but I haven't got time for that nonsense. So this is the best you're going to get out of me here. I would say the aroma there is very close. No obvious difference. The flavour is almost identical, if not completely identical. I wouldn't be able to pick the aromas apart. It's very, very little difference, if any at all. So that's got to be a win for the ITAP and counter pressure bottle filling in general, based on that sample, especially if you keep the beers at a sensible temperature. Now, what about when we keep it at room temperature? Okay, I think there is a little bit of a difference on this one. This one still has good aroma, but it's a bit more of a sticky, almost resiny like aroma on it. It actually is starting to smell a little bit more kind of like a West Coast beer as opposed to a hazy New England style. And the flavour has changed a little bit as well. So yeah, the hop flavour on this, it's still tasty. It doesn't taste obviously oxidized or impaired, but it's just starting to go a little bit, yeah, again, similar to the aroma. This is starting to develop a little bit more of a kind of sticky, resiny, piney character as opposed to that like bright citrus kind of tropical notes that I'm getting on this one, which is kind of interesting. So I don't think that is necessarily clear oxidation, but it might just be being kept at room temperature. The hop flavour has deteriorated slightly or aged out a little bit, or whatever you want to call it. There may be an element of oxidation in there as well, but it's more of a change of flavour as opposed to what I would say would be obvious deterioration in flavour. So that's quite interesting, but there's definitely a difference between that one and the beer that was kept at fridge temperature. Right, so plastic bottles, slightly concerned about how this one's going to go. So now we've got the plastic bottle that was in the fridge. And yeah, the aroma it's a little bit like the beer that I've just tried. So the glass bottle that was warm, but it's gone further. I think there is a little bit of a note of that kind of slightly stale beer. Maybe a little hint of cardboard there. It's okay, it's not too bad. It doesn't have that kind of nasty, when I get really bad oxidized sort of hazy beer like this, it tends to emphasize the bitterness over everything else. You start to get a sort of almost like at the same time as that bitterness, a kind of weird jammy kind of cloying note to it as well. It's definitely not gone to that point, but it is becoming more bitter. The hop brightness and flavour has kind of left the building a little bit there. You can still tell that it's got some nice kind of, fruity tropical hops in the mix, but it's pretty obvious compared to that this is going downhill fairly fast at this point. And on the back end, it starts to become slightly, starting to get more of that oxidized character on the aftertaste, where it just becomes a little bit unpleasant. But yeah, it would be scored down significantly in competition, I think, that beer, and that has been kept in a fridge, so it's been at optimum temperature. You know, it's deteriorated quite a lot for 4 weeks. And finally, the one that I know is going to be pretty bad. So we've got the room temperature PET bottle. So again, this is about 4 weeks, bit over 4 weeks worth of time in a PET bottle at room temperature. We've had a fairly warm spell recently, so you know it's probably been at least 20 degrees on average, maybe a bit higher. The colour tells the story. It's not gone completely dishwater brown, but it's going to be there fairly soon. The aroma is now starting to smell a little bit sherry-like, cardboard soaked in sherry, everyone's favourite beer aroma. There's still some hops there. I'm being a little bit harsh, but this is absolutely chalk and cheese. Now, I don't smell anything like each other, and I think most people who've experienced a kind of hazy beer like this that has gone oxidized would probably be getting that impression pretty much straight away just off of the aroma. So flavour's not as bad as I expected, but it's not great. It's starting to taste a little bit, again, bit cardboardy, more so than the other plastic bottle, as you would expect, and hop flavour is more muted. It's still there is still hop flavour, but bitterness is emphasised. Yeah, it's one way you'd be like, I'm not going to finish that because it's not great. Tell you what, it's making the keg beer taste awesome right now though. So yeah, everything, flavour's always relative, right? But yeah, classic signs of oxidation on that. It's not gone as far as I thought it would have, to be honest. I was expecting it to be really, really dark in colour. It is a big change, obviously, compared to that, but the flavours, there's a lot of hop flavour in there from the incognito. Maybe that has stood up a little bit better for whatever reason, but it's going towards cardboard, sherry. Hasn't quite got that jamminess in there, but it's now more bitter forward than kind of sweet tropical fruit. It's not great. It's not an amazingly pleasant beverage to drink anymore. So there we go. Some of those results, pretty unsurprising, I guess. But also, I think we've shown in this little bit of evidence that there is clearly a difference there in terms of the PET bottles versus the glass bottles. And this is a beer that's going to be more susceptible to issues which come from oxidation. So if the primary driver of these changes is oxidation, as the evidence that you can see visually here would suggest it is, then you know, maybe that permeability factor that we've talked about is an issue. Obviously, the heat difference is going to accelerate any changes there, but we can see that this beer is on the way to the same place as this one. It's just taking a bit longer because it was kept at a lower temperature. So you know, heat will accelerate any kind of chemical reaction or process, as we can see here. So for me, it kind of pretty much confirms my experience up to this point and my thoughts on PET versus glass bottles. I still use PET bottles if I know that the beer is going to be getting consumed fairly quickly. Even for beer mail, though, to be honest, I tend to now use glass bottles because I want, if I'm paying money to send people beers, I want them to get the best drinking experience out of that is possible. And I kind of know that the best way to guarantee that is to use the glass bottles over the PET, even if it might cost me a little bit more money and I run the risk of those bottles perhaps getting broken in transit. That's what I'd rather do, and especially for competition purposes, you know, glass is not gonna let, you know, oxygen in. There may be a little bit of oxygen in there through your packaging process, which is potentially going to cause you issues. If it's kept at a high temperature and the storage conditions aren't ideal, as we've seen here, there may still be changes in terms of the flavour, degrading a little bit or changing at least over time. But I don't think either of these beers that were in glass bottles you would say have any off flavours as such, not to my palate. And in fact, this one that was kept at the cooler temperature, to me, is basically identical to the control sample. So take from that what you will. I think it's a pretty clear demonstration of my own personal experience and what I've seen. I think there's other factors that play into this as well, in terms of, you know, obviously certain beer styles will be more affected by it. This was kind of designed to emphasize the impact of oxidation by using a hazy beer. Other beer styles, stronger beers, whatever, may not show those effects as quickly or be as obviously impaired by that oxidation factor. But, you know, oxygen is bad for any beer at the end of the day, and if you can do anything that you can to keep oxygen out of your beer, which is certainly something that I've made a lot more effort to try and achieve in recent years, then it can only be good for your beer, whether it be in the long term or for competition purposes, for your own consumption or sending it out to other people. You know, we all know that oxygen is not good for beer. Some people will say that it's a big overblown thing and you don't need to worry about it, but they're full of shit, so ignore those people. Professional breweries will do everything they can in their power to minimize oxygen for a good reason, and that's why. So yeah, let me know your thoughts in the comments. If you've got any experience as far as using plastic versus glass and so on and so forth, tell me about it in the comments. Let me know if you enjoyed this video, and please hit the subscribe button, like the video. Again, drop a comment in below if you can, and follow me on the channels that are linked on the screen as well. Cheers everyone, and I'll see you on the next one.
I'm the dude, so that's what you call me, you know? That or his dudeness, or duder, or, you know, El Duderino if you're not into the whole brevity thing.